What if the darkest mysteries of the ancient world were never carved in stone, never whispered in myths, but buried in the forbidden rituals of the Canaanite cults themselves? Imagine stepping into a world where faith was intertwined with fear, where sacred altars cast shadows longer than any temple wall, and where the line between devotion and brutality dissolved into a haze of fire, chants, and offerings no one dared question. The Canaanite cults were not merely religious communities. They were engines of power, authority, and submission, built on rituals so twisted and dangerous that even neighboring civilizations recoiled in disbelief. And yet, within those rituals, a terrifying truth emerges. People followed them willingly, convinced that their obedience shaped the fate of the gods. To understand the depth of these practices, you need to picture an ancient society ruled not by kings alone, but by priests who mastered fear as if it were a sacred tool. These priests invoked the names of deities associated with storms, fertility, and destruction, channeling cosmic threats into earthly commands. Every ritual carried a symbolic weight. Every offering became a negotiation with forces believed to shape harvests, wars, and destiny itself. But beneath that spiritual facade lived a world of coercion, manipulation, and ritualistic spectacle designed to keep people loyal, trembling, and unquestioning. This introduction is your first step into those hidden chambers, where torches flickered against stone walls and chants echoed through the night, creating an atmosphere thick with devotion and dread. You are entering a realm where rituals justified cruelty, where suffering was transformed into sacred currency, and where the ancient clergy protected their secrets with brutal determination. As you begin to uncover these twisted practices, a question lingers in the air like a distant drumbeat. How far could a civilization go in the name of pleasing its gods? You may have heard fragments of these stories before, scattered across archaeological studies or hinted at in obscure historical references. But here, we pull back the curtain completely, revealing the raw, unsettling core of rites that shaped entire generations. And as we do, something becomes clear. These ancient practices were not simply acts of devotion, but calculated displays of dominance, fear, and supernatural promise. What you are about to see may challenge your understanding of ancient spirituality and expose a side of history rarely spoken aloud. You already feel the weight of these revelations taking shape, and this is the moment where I invite you to take part in the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if anything so far has made you rethink what ancient rituals really meant. Do not forget to like the video and check whether you are subscribed, because understanding these hidden truths becomes even more powerful when you follow each chapter of this exploration. What you will uncover next might surprise you, and the path forward only grows darker and more intriguing as we continue into the heart of these forgotten rites, where each step leads deeper into practices that shaped the spiritual fears of an entire civilization. The deeper you move into the sacred chambers of the Canaanite world, the more the atmosphere tightens around you, as if the very stones remember the weight of the offerings once placed upon them. Among the most unsettling aspects of their devotion were the enigmatic sacrifices that sustained both the spiritual identity of the cults and the commanding presence of their priests. These offerings were not simple gestures of gratitude. They were woven into a system where fear, obligation, and divine negotiation merged into a single ritual performance. Every act carried symbolic meaning, crafted to keep the worshiper dependent on the spiritual guardians who interpreted the god's desires. At the heart of these sacrifices stood the belief that balance between the earthly and the divine could collapse at any moment. Crops could fail, storms could devastate, illness could sweep through villages without warning. The priests positioned themselves as the sole interpreters of these threats, claiming that only through precise offerings could chaos be contained. They measured the worth of each sacrifice with a calculated sense of ceremony, transforming ordinary objects into vessels of spiritual currency. The community gathered around these altars not out of genuine enlightenment, but out of the mounting anxiety that the gods demanded more than simple devotion. As these rituals unfolded, participants often found themselves trapped in a cycle where obedience became indistinguishable from survival. Priests emphasized that the gods craved renewal, cleansing, and appeasement, and the offerings became a living language through which fear could be expressed without rebellion. The ritual, smoke rose into the sky as an unspoken reminder that no one controlled their own destiny. Power rested in the hands of those who interpreted the divine. Through repetition and spectacle, the sacrifices became ingrained in every aspect of cultural life, shaping the way people understood calamity, fortune, and justice. The rituals also served to reinforce social hierarchies. Those chosen to present offerings were often individuals seeking favor, forgiveness, or protection. The priests, standing above them, maintained the illusion that they alone could temper the wrath of unpredictable gods. In this world, every sacrifice reaffirmed the clergy's authority, turning spiritual acts into public displays of submission. Even the objects offered held significance, as they symbolized the hopes and fears of entire families who believed that compliance could bring relief. But beneath the orderly facade lay something more complex, a system designed to remind the community that their lives were intertwined with forces beyond their control, forces that the cult leaders claimed to command. Each ritual created an emotional vacuum, blending reverence with unease, as participants wondered whether their offerings were enough to prevent the misfortunes looming at the edges of their world. And as these ceremonies grew in intensity, they set the foundation for far darker practices, ones that blurred boundaries between purification and violence, devotion and intimidation, shaping a religious environment where fear became inseparable from faith, and where each new ritual hinted at deeper shadows waiting to be exposed in the hidden corridors of the ancient cults. As the night deepened over the stone altars of the Canaanite sanctuaries, the air became thick with incense and tension, a tangible reminder that every ritual was a negotiation between the mortal and the divine. Among the most sinister of these ceremonies were the blood rites and forbidden purifications, acts designed to manipulate both the body and the mind of the faithful. These rituals were carefully orchestrated to enforce obedience, instill awe, and maintain the rigid hierarchy that allowed the priests to consolidate absolute spiritual authority. Each gesture, chant, and offering carried a coded meaning understood only by those initiated, a language of power and control encoded into the very rhythm of the cult. These blood rituals were not mere symbolism. Livestock, grains, or precious metals were offered, but occasionally human participants became part of the ceremonial tableau, their presence elevating the ritual to a level of terror that etched obedience into memory. The priests claimed that through these acts the divine could be coaxed to grant prosperity, avert plagues, or bring victory in conflict. Yet beneath the surface, there was a psychological architecture at work, fear and reverence entwined, shaping the community's perception of the sacred and binding them to the clergy's commands. Those who hesitated, questioned, or resisted found themselves subjected to scrutiny, isolation, or punitive rites that reinforced submission. Purification rituals, equally severe, required participants to endure exposure, fasting, or symbolic suffering intended to cleanse both body and spirit. These practices were portrayed as transformative, a passage into favor and enlightenment, yet they operated as tools of control. Participants internalized the idea that only through absolute compliance could the gods be appeased, and the priests wielded this knowledge as a form of spiritual leverage. The repetition of these rites, often on a strict lunar or seasonal calendar, reinforced the inevitability of obedience and magnified the psychological impact on those participating. The ceremonies also included elaborate use of sacred objects, cryptic chants, and symbolic gestures that framed compliance as a sacred duty and dissent as a transgression against cosmic order. The priest's authority was reinforced through intimidation, secrecy, and the selective revelation of arcane knowledge, creating an environment where questioning the ritual was tantamount to challenging the divine itself. This interplay of fear, mysticism, and spectacle ensured that the cult's influence penetrated the fabric of everyday life, guiding behavior, shaping social norms, and consolidating power in ways that transcended ordinary governance. As the participants internalized these rituals, a culture of obedience and awe was cultivated, one where the line between devotion and coercion became indistinguishable. Every act, no matter how minor, was amplified by the weight of the unseen, by the suggestion that failure or hesitation might provoke the wrath of the gods. It was within this tension, between reverence and terror, that the Canaanite priests exercised unparalleled influence, crafting rituals that were as psychologically manipulative as they were spiritually profound. And as we trace these practices further, we begin to see how they laid the groundwork for even darker rites, rituals that crossed thresholds of human endurance, blending punishment, fear, and devotion into a single, unforgettable experience that defined the spiritual and social structure of the cults. Beyond the public and semi-public rites, there existed ceremonies so secretive that even the bravest of acolytes spoke of them only in whispers. Within the inner sanctums of the Canaanite cults, punishments and trials were conducted that would chill any observer. Methods designed to enforce loyalty, subjugate doubt, and demonstrate the absolute power of the clergy. These were not casual admonishments or symbolic gestures. They were carefully orchestrated spectacles, executed in darkness and shadow, where fear became as tangible as the stone walls that enclosed the participants. To understand the magnitude of these secret ceremonies, one must grasp that obedience was not merely encouraged, it was enforced through a combination of psychological pressure, ritualized humiliation, and the looming threat of spiritual condemnation. The inner rites often involved isolation in dimly lit chambers, with chants echoing from unseen corners, reinforcing the impression that the gods themselves observed every action, every hesitation. The accused, whether for doubt, disobedience, or insufficient zeal, were made to endure tasks and ordeals that blurred the line between physical endurance and spiritual test. Fasting, exposure to extremes, and symbolic enactments of death and rebirth were all employed, amplifying both fear and awe. Each action was layered with symbolic meaning, ensuring that the participant internalized the cult's doctrine, associating obedience with survival, revelation, and divine favor. These secret punishments were also designed to reinforce hierarchy and submission. Priests would selectively reveal arcane knowledge while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of defiance. The power dynamics within these chambers created a psychological architecture that left participants in a constant state of tension, their loyalty cemented not just through faith, but through an intimate understanding of the cost of failure. Those who survived the ordeal often emerged more devoted, more willing to adhere to rituals unquestioningly, and more likely to carry the message of fear and obedience back into the larger community. The boundaries between sacred duty and coercion were meticulously maintained, ensuring that even the most devout adherents recognized the consequences of dissent. It was within this framework that punishment and indoctrination became indistinguishable from religious devotion. Every test, every hidden ritual was an assertion of control by the clergy over both mind and body. The rituals demanded that participants confront their deepest fears, their doubts, and their mortality, and submit entirely to the authority of the cult leaders. This created an environment in which spiritual terror reinforced social cohesion, embedding compliance into the very psyche of the faithful. Now, as you consider the severity of these hidden ceremonies, reflect on the chilling efficiency of a system that harnessed fear as a sacred instrument. The boundaries between devotion and terror were deliberately blurred, and each participant became both witness and agent in a ritual theater that shaped loyalty and subjugation alike. If this account unsettles you, if it challenges your understanding of devotion and power, I invite you to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Discuss what aspect strikes you the most. Was it the psychological manipulation, the ritualized suffering, or the sheer audacity of control? Your insight is part of understanding how such dark practices shape the lives of those bound by them, and your engagement helps reveal just how complex and chilling these cults truly were. As the veil of secrecy deepened within the Canaanite cults, the practices extended beyond punishments into the realm of invocation and spiritual pacts, blending the divine with the dangerously profane. These rituals were not simple appeals to gods for favor or protection. They were carefully structured performances intended to bend unseen forces to the will of the clergy, demonstrating an authority that transcended mortal limitations. Initiates were drawn into intricate ceremonies where every gesture, every chant, and every offering acted as both plea and contract, creating a sense of inevitability that obedience could shape the cosmos itself. The perceived proximity to supernatural power gave the priests leverage unmatched by kings or generals, reinforcing an almost absolute spiritual dominion. The methods of invocation were complex, often requiring precise timing, aligned with celestial movements, sacred numerology, and ritualized sequences of chants and gestures. Participants were taught that the efficacy of the ritual depended not only on adherence to form, but on the intensity of devotion and the completeness of submission. The slightest hesitation, the faintest error, could render the offering void, potentially inviting divine retribution upon themselves or the community. This intricate framework created a psychological tension, binding the worshiper in a constant state of anticipation and fear, where failure carried consequences both real and imagined. Central to these practices were pacts with divine or semi-divine entities, described in obscure texts and transmitted orally through generations. These pacts were framed as necessary to ensure fertility, victory in battle, or protection from unseen forces, yet they were also mechanisms of control. The priests claimed that they alone possessed the knowledge to broker these agreements, translating the will of the gods into actionable commands. Those who questioned or challenged the process risked excommunication, shame, or spiritual condemnation, effectively reinforcing compliance through existential fear. The result was a system where spiritual aspiration and psychological subjugation became inseparable, and the power of the cult lay as much in belief as in enforcement. Some ceremonies involved symbolic or literal binding, where the participant's life, family, or property became intertwined with the ritual outcome. This fusion of physical, psychological, and spiritual stakes created a totalizing form of devotion. Obedience was not optional, and the cost of failure extended beyond the individual to affect entire households or communities. The fear of invoking divine wrath, combined with the promise of supernatural favor, ensured that adherents internalized the cult's authority, turning personal faith into a tool for systemic control. These invocations and pacts also served to consolidate political and social hierarchies within the cult, positioning priests as intermediaries between mortal and divine, whose interpretation of the ritual determined outcomes. Every step of the ceremony reinforced the clergy's supremacy, creating a feedback loop where devotion and fear reinforced obedience, and obedience reinforced the perceived potency of the rituals. As we examine these practices, it becomes evident how the Canaanite cults blurred the boundaries between spiritual guidance and psychological dominion, crafting a religious system in which the divine and the manipulative were inseparable and where power was exercised through both faith and fear, ensuring the loyalty of all who entered their sacred and perilous domain. As the Canaanite cults evolved, their rituals began to transform obedience into a form of psychological mastery, where devotion itself became a mechanism of control. Within the inner sanctums, priests employed ceremonies designed to convert fear into unquestioned loyalty, ensuring that participants internalized the authority of the clergy as an intrinsic truth. These rituals often involved elaborate sequences of symbolic actions, gestures, and chants, carefully calibrated to demonstrate both the power of the divine and the supremacy of those mediating its will. Each repetition of a ritual reinforced social hierarchies, entrenched spiritual authority, and shaped the consciousness of the faithful, creating a system where compliance was as natural as breathing. The psychological dimension of these rites was deliberate. By blending symbolic suffering, controlled exposure to spiritual narratives, and intricate ceremonial performance, priests established an environment in which participants' perception of reality became intertwined with the dictates of the cult. Individuals were taught that doubt, hesitation, or disobedience risked invoking divine wrath not only upon themselves, but also upon their families and communities. This cultivation of existential anxiety ensured that participants internalized obedience, creating a self-perpetuating structure where devotion and fear were inseparable. Every ritual, every gesture, every symbolic offering acted as a reinforcement of authority, turning faith into a weapon of social cohesion and manipulation. Moreover, these practices were often publicized selectively, creating layers of transparency and secrecy that amplified their impact. Spectators and initiates witnessed certain rites, while others remained hidden, fostering an aura of mystery and power around the priests and their ceremonies. The community's awareness that some actions were forbidden, unseen, and potentially devastating reinforced the perception that the clergy commanded forces beyond mortal comprehension. The combination of fear, awe, and curiosity created a psychological environment where the priesthood could dictate behavior through both visible ritual and the threat of unseen acts, solidifying control over both body and mind. Another aspect of these ritualized manipulations involved the deliberate staging of consequences for disobedience. Participants observed the punishments, symbolic or real, meted out to those who failed to meet ritual expectations, turning the communal gaze into an instrument of compliance. These observed consequences operated as a powerful deterrent, reinforcing the narrative that the divine, mediated through the priests, was both omnipresent and omnipotent. This dual reinforcement, through direct participation and observation, ensured that obedience became internalized and normalized across generations, shaping the moral and spiritual framework of the society itself. Ultimately, these ceremonies transformed devotion into a systemic mechanism of psychological and social control. Every act of ritual compliance served not only the spiritual objectives of the cult, but also reinforced the authority of the clergy, making obedience a condition of existential security. The participants' minds were shaped as much as their actions, and the cult's influence extended into the very perceptions of reality, where the sacred and the controlling merged into an inseparable force. Understanding these methods reveals how fear, devotion, and ritual could be engineered to sustain hierarchies, consolidate power, and mold entire populations into compliant, faithful participants in the cult's enduring legacy. The Canaanite cult's most disturbing rituals often revolved around clandestine rites where physical suffering became a bridge to supposed supernatural power. Within these secret ceremonies, priests subjected participants to trials that tested endurance, faith, and psychological resilience, creating an environment where pain was inseparably linked to spiritual reward. These rituals were carefully choreographed to instill obedience, magnify fear, and demonstrate the priest's absolute control. Every participant understood that their actions, their compliance, and even their capacity to endure pain were being measured, interpreted, and recorded, reinforcing the supremacy of the cult leaders in ways that transcended ordinary authority. These rites often involved prolonged exposure to extremes, harsh temperatures, fasting, and confinement in spaces designed to disorient or intimidate. The participants' senses were heightened, their minds sharpened by the tension of imminent consequence. Each stage of the ritual carried symbolic meaning. The infliction of controlled pain represented purification, devotion, or submission, and failure signaled disfavor from the divine. Within this framework, suffering was not random. It was a meticulously designed instrument of psychological conditioning, embedding the cult's doctrines deep within the participants' consciousness. Pain became a language through which obedience was encoded, and survival depended on absolute conformity. The psychological impact of these clandestine ceremonies extended beyond the immediate participants. Witnessing these acts of endurance, whether from the periphery of the inner sanctum or through carefully constructed storytelling, reinforced communal compliance. Families, neighbors, and potential initiates internalized the consequences of disobedience, learning that the cult wielded power not only through divine sanction, but also through meticulously controlled ritualized terror. The priests orchestrated every moment, ensuring that fear, awe, and reverence worked in concert, producing a population whose loyalty was maintained by both belief and apprehension. Moreover, the rituals functioned as both spiritual and social reinforcement. Participants who endured the trials were elevated within the community, their survival interpreted as divine favor, while those who faltered were quietly marginalized or subjected to further secretive punishments. This dual mechanism ensured that obedience was desirable and advantageous, embedding compliance into the social hierarchy. Every trial, every act of endurance further solidified the priest's authority, demonstrating that mastery over human suffering was as critical to their power as knowledge of the gods. In this shadowed world, fear was transformed into devotion, and suffering became a conduit to authority. The rituals reinforced the perception that divine power was inseparable from the priesthood's control, creating a cycle of obedience and terror that permeated the culture. It is here, at the intersection of pain, faith, and domination, that the Canaanite cults exercised some of their most terrifying influence. The lessons learned within these inner chambers were carried into daily life, ensuring that the population internalized the hierarchy and the fear that sustained it. Now, reflecting on these clandestine and extreme practices, consider the depth of control and the intensity of indoctrination that shaped participants' perceptions of power, devotion, and survival. If this account unsettles you, leave a comment below sharing which part of these rituals strikes you as most shocking or revealing. Your insights help illuminate the complex psychological architecture behind these cult practices, and engaging in discussion ensures that these dark truths, buried for centuries, are neither ignored nor forgotten. As the Canaanite cults advanced their secretive practices, they developed rituals of malediction and destruction, wielding spiritual ceremonies as instruments to eliminate rivals, enemies, or those who threatened the authority of the priesthood. These rites were carefully constructed, blending symbolism with psychological pressure, where curses, incantations, and ritualized gestures became methods of social control as much as spiritual practice. Within the walls of the inner sanctums, priests invoked powers believed to govern fortune, health, and fate itself, while simultaneously demonstrating that their influence extended into the mortal sphere, capable of bringing misfortune or calamity upon any target who crossed them. The execution of these rituals involved a combination of public and private acts. Publicly, the community witnessed offerings and incantations designed to enforce the perception of divine omnipotence. Privately, the target of a malediction might be subjected to symbolic or practical measures that ensured compliance, fear, or social isolation. Each gesture and word carried meaning, communicated through a shared understanding of the cult's spiritual and social hierarchy. The power of the priests was magnified not only by the efficacy of their rituals, but by the perception that defiance would invoke the wrath of forces beyond human comprehension. These rites also functioned as deterrents, a warning to others within and outside the cult. Observers, whether fellow devotees or neighboring communities, internalized the consequences of opposition. The psychological imprint of witnessing or knowing of a curse or destructive ritual created a pervasive climate of caution and obedience. Over time, this reinforced the authority of the clergy, as the line between spiritual judgment and social punishment became increasingly blurred. Fear, amplified by the belief in supernatural sanction, became an essential tool for consolidating and maintaining power. Moreover, the rituals of malediction and destruction were often paired with elaborate ceremonies designed to dramatize the priesthood's ability to manipulate outcomes. Sacred objects, cryptic language, and precise timing aligned with natural and celestial cycles reinforced the impression that every act was potent, deliberate, and divinely sanctioned. Participants learned that compliance, vigilance, and reverence were essential for personal safety and communal stability, embedding a psychological framework in which ritual observance became inseparable from survival. In addition, these practices underscored the strategic use of secrecy. By controlling who witnessed the most potent ceremonies, the priests ensured that knowledge was limited, creating an aura of mystery and heightening perceived efficacy. Those who were initiated gained a sense of empowerment and understanding, while the uninitiated remained aware that unseen forces could influence their fate. This selective visibility reinforced social hierarchies, emphasized obedience, and amplified the perceived power of the cult, ensuring that influence extended well beyond the immediate participants. The combination of fear, secrecy, and ritualized influence produced a sophisticated mechanism of social and spirituals control. By aligning destructive acts with divine authority, the priests transformed malediction into a tool for enforcing hierarchy, loyalty, and submission. The community, observing the consequences, internalized the power structure, creating a population bound by belief, apprehension, and respect. As we explore these dark ceremonies, it becomes evident how fear, manipulation, and ritual were employed to achieve dominion, blending the spiritual and the coercive into an inseparable instrument of control that shaped the lives and minds of all who encountered these secretive cults. The Canaanite cult's rituals extended even further into practices that transformed collective fear into a means of societal control, shaping communities through psychological dominance rather than direct violence. These ceremonies were often designed to reinforce the perception that disobedience or dissent could provoke not only divine wrath, but also tangible consequences within the social and spiritual order. The priests wielded an extraordinary power, the ability to instill anxiety, manipulate expectation, and orchestrate the belief that compliance was not only pious, but necessary for survival. In this way, the rituals blurred the line between spiritual devotion and strategic subjugation, creating a culture where obedience was internalized and fear became an invisible yet omnipresent force. At the core of these practices was the concept that the community itself could be marshaled as an instrument of control. Public rituals demonstrated the consequences of transgression, while secretive rites reinforced the reach and authority of the clergy. The repetition of ceremonies, the meticulous staging of offerings, and the controlled dissemination of knowledge ensured that every participant and observer understood the risks of defiance. Through these rituals, the priests cultivated a culture in which fear and belief were intertwined, making compliance appear natural, even voluntary, while the underlying threat of punishment, whether spiritual, social, or psychological, ensured that obedience remained absolute. The most sophisticated aspect of these practices was their capacity to transform uncertainty into control. The priests manipulated what was seen and unseen, known and unknown, creating an environment in which individuals constantly questioned their own judgment and assessed the consequences of every thought or action. Rituals incorporated symbolic gestures, coded language, and precise timings aligned with celestial or seasonal cycles, reinforcing the perception that the clergy's authority was divinely sanctioned and impossible to challenge. Even those who outwardly appeared to act freely were guided, subtly and systematically, towards submission through carefully calibrated experiences of awe, dread, and reverence. These strategies also functioned as mechanisms of social cohesion. By instilling shared fears and collective reverence, the rituals created bonds within the community, aligning personal behavior with communal norms dictated by spiritual authority. Participants became both agents and observers of compliance, internalizing the cult's hierarchy and transmitting its influence across generations. In this way, the Canaanite clergy exercised a form of social engineering, transforming belief into behavior and fear into obedience, ensuring that the cult's doctrines endured beyond individual lifetimes and maintained control over the broader society. Ultimately, these practices illustrate the extraordinary sophistication of the Canaanite cult's approach to power. Through rituals of fear, devotion, and symbolic manipulation, the clergy engineered a system in which control was embedded in both mind and community. The population's beliefs, actions, and even internal perceptions were shaped by ceremonies designed to enforce hierarchy, obedience, and reverence. As we follow the arc of these rituals, the scale of their influence becomes clear. The fear they inspired was not incidental, it was intentional, a tool for social, spiritual, and psychological domination that extended far beyond the altar, shaping entire civilizations and leaving an enduring legacy in the shadows of history. The Canaanite cult's rituals extended even further into practices that transformed collective fear into a means of societal control, shaping communities through psychological dominance rather than direct violence. These ceremonies were often designed to reinforce the perception that disobedience or dissent could provoke not only divine wrath, but also tangible consequences within the social and spiritual order. The priests wielded an extraordinary power, the ability to instill anxiety, manipulate expectation, and orchestrate the belief that compliance was not only pious, but necessary for survival. In this way, the rituals blurred the line between spiritual devotion and strategic subjugation, creating a culture where obedience was internalized and fear became an invisible yet omnipresent force. At the core of these practices was the concept that the community itself could be marshaled as an instrument of control. Public rituals demonstrated the consequences of transgression, while secretive rites reinforced the reach and authority of the clergy. The repetition of ceremonies, the meticulous staging of offerings, and the controlled dissemination of knowledge ensured that every participant and observer understood the risks of defiance. Through these rituals, the priests cultivated a culture in which fear and belief were intertwined, making compliance appear natural, even voluntary, while the underlying threat of punishment, whether spiritual, social, or psychological, ensured that obedience remained absolute. The most sophisticated aspect of these practices was their capacity to transform uncertainty into control. The priests manipulated what was seen and unseen, known and unknown, creating an environment in which individuals constantly questioned their own judgment and assessed the consequences of every thought or action. Rituals incorporated symbolic gestures, coded language, and precise timings aligned with celestial or seasonal cycles, reinforcing the perception that the clergy's authority was divinely sanctioned and impossible to challenge. Even those who outwardly appeared to act freely were guided, subtly and systematically, toward submission through carefully calibrated experiences of awe, dread, and reverence. These strategies also functioned as mechanisms of social cohesion. By instilling shared fears and collective reverence, the rituals created bonds within the community, aligning personal behavior with communal norms dictated by spiritual authority. Participants became both agents and observers of compliance, internalizing the cult's hierarchy and transmitting its influence across generations. In this way, the Canaanite clergy exercised a form of social engineering, transforming belief into behavior and fear into obedience, ensuring that the cult's doctrines endured beyond individual lifetimes and maintained control over the broader society. Ultimately, these practices illustrate the extraordinary sophistication of the Canaanite cult's approach to power. Through rituals of fear, devotion, and symbolic manipulation, the clergy engineered a system in which control was embedded in both mind and community. The population's beliefs, actions, and even internal perceptions were shaped by ceremonies designed to enforce hierarchy, obedience, and reverence. As we follow the arc of these rituals, the scale of their influence becomes clear. The fear they inspired was not incidental, it was intentional, a tool for social, spiritual, and psychological domination that extended far beyond the altar, shaping entire civilizations and leaving an enduring legacy in the shadows of history.